ਗੁਰੂ ਪਿਆਰੀ ਸਾਧ ਸੰਗਤ ਜੀ, ਹੁਣ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਦਵਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ ਤੂਰ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ 18ਵੀਂ ਸਦੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਿੱਖ ਰਾਜ ਦੇ ਵਿਸਤਾਰ ਅਤੇ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਉਹਦੇ ਘਟਨ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਸਾਂਝੇ ਕਰਨਗੇ। ਸਰਦਾਰ ਦਵਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ ਤੂਰ ਨਵੀਂ ਪੀੜ੍ਹੀ ਦੇ ਆਰਟ ਕਲੈਕਟਰ ਨੇ। ਆਪ ਜੀ ਵਿਕਟੋਰੀਆ ਐਂਡ ਐਲਬਰਟਸ ਮਿਊਜ਼ੀਅਮ ਦੇ ਮਸ਼ਹੂਰ ਆਰਟਸ ਆਫ ਏਸ਼ੀਆ ਕੋਰਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਰਟਸ ਆਫ ਦ ਰਾਇਲ ਸਿੱਖ ਕੋਰਟਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਲੈਕਚਰ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਨ। Guru Pyari Saad Sangat Ji, Sardar Davinder Singh Ji Toor will be giving a talk on the Sikh Empire's meteoric rise in the 18th century and its collapse half a century later. He will use a stunning selection of rare artworks and remarkable objects from the world's finest private collection of Sikh art. Sardar Davinder Singh Toor Ji is a leading figure amongst new generation of Sikh art collectors. He has acted as a consultant to major private collectors, auction houses and museums. He currently lectures on the arts of the Royal Sikh Court subject for the Victoria and Albert Museum's prestigious Arts of the Asia course. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Hello everyone, thank you very much for attending. First of all, I'd like to say my thanks to the organisers here, particularly Harsimran, who made contact and has helped us so much in facilitating our journey here. And I'm very honoured to be presenting here to you. So I'm going to give you some insight into, or tell the story, if I can, of the rise and fall of the Sikh Empire, but through art, through artworks. I'm a collector myself of Sikh art, and I've been collecting Sikh art for about 20 years now. Just a little bit about my journey. When I was 18, just before I started university, I was a volunteer at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. They had an exhibition that some of you may have visited or are aware of called The Arts of the Sikh Kingdoms. And it was an exhibition that they ran to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the Khalsa in 1999. And I was a volunteer at that show. And that was my first interaction at the age of 18 with objects connected to my history, your history. You know, to see them physically was fascinating for me. The next revelation for me was to find out that actually you could still find these objects, find these works of art. They weren't all behind glass in museums. You could trace them, hunt them down and acquire them. And that's what I began to do. I had many interests and hobbies as a kid, and they came and went. But this one stuck for some reason. And the reason why it stuck was because of certain events that took place that kept me hooked. One such event was this. A photographic dealer got in touch. Thanks, Simran. A photographic dealer got in touch and said, you may want to come over and have a look. He said, I've got an album that has got some photographs of some Sikhs, and something may be of interest to you. Why don't you come and have a look? So I went there with a cousin of mine, and we went and had a look, flicking through. And at this stage of my collecting career, I think I was probably in my early 20s at the time, we were just looking for anything Sikh, any images of any Sikhs from any era, and we were flicking through this album, and suddenly my eyes were focused on this picture on the bottom left. I hadn't yet become an active collector. I was buying anything and everything Indian old that I could find. And in particular, the man in the second from the right, in the bottom left, I had a look closer at him. And if you go to the next slide, please, Simran. That man there, and there. Okay, keep the slide there. It was the same man here on the bottom left. And I found myself looking at my grandfather. By chance, complete chance. This is my Nana Ji, and this was a photographic album made by a leaf from an English officer's album from Burma during the Second World War. And I heard some stories about him growing up, but not many. But to physically come into contact with he was a polo player, to physically come into contact with an old image of him was amazing. The chances of that happening are just, you couldn't predict it. But events like that, obviously we bought the album. And there were 4 pictures in that album of him. And my mother was fascinated when she saw it. But things like that really keep you going, keep you searching, keep you looking. If we go to the next slide, please, Simran. Thank you. So we're going to look, we've got about half an hour or so, to have a look at the story of the Sikhs. And I don't think there's any better way to tell that story through artifacts, through pictures, through objects, through those tangible things that we can connect to. And it's those objects, it's not necessarily just the objects that we're interested in the people behind those objects. Those are the people that we're trying to connect to, and both consciously and subconsciously for myself, it was all about understanding myself in the present moment. But how was I going to understand myself in the present moment if I didn't understand the past? And it's not, what isn't about recreating that past, but it's just understanding about how we developed. Let's look at the landscape of Punjab. Thank you. A true melting pot. You really, when we look at these works of art, what I kind of really encourage you to do is we look at these old, antique works of art and we think about them being old. I want you for a second, when you look at these, to think about them once being new. Think about when they were first made, who they were made for, who they were made by, why they were made. But we need to appreciate the landscape. Now, Punjab was a true melting pot. It was a land once inhabited by the Greeks, Persians, Turks, the Mughals, the Afghans. And as a result, it was this mixing pot, many different cultures and religions coming together. It's said that the great battles of the Mahabharata took place here, and it was on the Silk Road. It was of interest to many people in that surrounding area, and this is where we know where Guru Nanak is born in the 15th century. Next slide, please, Simran. Here is an early portrait of Guru Nanak, and I found this portrait in a London auction, and it wasn't described as being Guru Nanak. Some of you may not even be able to detect who Guru Nanak is in this picture. Now, this is a picture that dates to the 19th century from Punjab. And Guru Nanak there is the central to the left figure with the black beard. It shows Guru Nanak in his younger years. This painting would have been one of many in a series of paintings of from the Janam Sakhis, telling the story, the life of Guru Nanak. And it shows him there with the Sufi topi and the seli, showing that he was representing all faiths. And this particular scene shows the meeting between Guru Nanak and the Kanpat yogis, the Siddhs, who in Achal Batala, between these two villages, Achal and Batala. And we can read about this in the Siddh Ghost in Guru Granth Sahib, where it talks about Guru Nanak having to justify himself to these Siddhs. They ask him questions about who he is, where he's from, what his beliefs are, and he explains that to them. Our story here begins with Guru Nanak, and you can get some wonderful details from this image. Not everything in Indian paintings or Bahari paintings is realistic to us. They're called allegorical paintings. They tell a story. It's a bit like a piece of music. The artist is compacting all of this information that we now have to, our task is to unpack and discover the message behind the picture. Guru Nanak challenged hypocrisy. Guru Nanak declared that there was no religious labels, that you would be judged upon based upon your character, and he was breaking down the caste system, and with that he started to attract a following. If we have the next slide, please, Simran. The Sikhs start to grow in power and in number. Now what we call Amritsar, Ramdaspur, was land that was gifted by the great Emperor Akbar to Guru Ramdas. And that land, which became known as Amritsar, is obviously famous for the Golden Temple of Amritsar, Darbar Sahib. And here we have a late 19th century painting which shows Guru Arjan Dev Ji on the right-hand side there. The perspective is a bit skewed here, but you see that he's overseeing the construction of Darbar Sahib. He's overseeing the construction of the Golden Temple. Now we know anyway that this is a 19th century painting of an earlier scene. The foundation stone for the Golden Temple was laid in 1588, but the current building, its structure, dates back to 1785. We know that in the Misl period it was destroyed and rebuilt a number of times, and the final structure that we see now was beneath the gold, dates from the late Misl period, and Ranjit Singh, we know Maharaja Ranjit Singh gilded the temple. Guru Arjan is famous for two things in particular. One is for compiling the Ard Granth, for collecting together the hymns of the Gurus before him. Secondly, we also know that he is the first in a long line of martyrs. He was executed on the orders of Emperor Jahangir. If we read Jahangir's memoirs, we can understand also the social climate at that time. And Jahangir actually writes about the execution of Guru Arjan, and he talks about it, and he says there's this man whose following is increasing. He said he's becoming increasingly popular, and he said, I need to shut down his shop. And that's how he describes the death of Guru Arjan. So we can think about it not just on a religious perspective, but on a socio-political perspective. He was a threat. The Sikhs were gaining power. Next slide, please. All of the images in this presentation, bar this one, all of the other images that you'll see, including the ones that you've seen, are all from works of art that I've managed to find and collect over the last 20 years. So this one is a very, very important portrait of the sixth Guru, Guru Har Gobind. Guru Har Gobind, this portrait dates to the middle of the 17th century. It's very rare. It's from the Bhai collection in India, and it's a contemporary portrait of the Guru. Contemporary portraits of the Guru very rarely survive. Many of the other paintings that I'm showing you date from the 19th century. Sikh art is very, very rare. It's very, very hard to find original Sikh art. And why is that? The reason for that is when does a community begin to produce art? It produces art when it has power, when it's sovereign, when the artists are given patronage. That time for the Sikhs only is about 50 years, really. It's during the reign of Maharaja Ranjit Singh he's born in 1780, he dies in 1839. So from that period, about 50 years approximately, Sikh art is being produced. So that's why it's very, very hard to find. So when you find an earlier portrait from the 17th century, from the times of the Gurus, it's very special. Now, Guru Har Gobind was 11 years old when his father, Guru Arjan Dev Ji, was executed. And here we see this shift. We see this change in that moment in Sikh philosophy and in the Sikh traditions. No thread or tilak was applied to him, as was the custom of the time, and instead he wishes to be anointed with the Guruship by asking for 2 swords. And those 2 swords, he says to the Sikhs, are to remind them that in order to safeguard their spiritual freedom, they need to think about their temporal, physical freedom also. The Sikhs are a little bit alarmed. If we read some of the old accounts, they're a little bit alarmed because he's very different to the Gurus who were around before. One such quote that I'll read you is from Bhai Gurdas, who was a poet of the time, who was said to possess the key to the Guru Granth Sahib. He understood the philosophy, and he says, and I'm going to read this to you. He says, people said that the former Gurus would sit in the temple, but the current Guru, Guru Har Gobind, remains not in one place. The former emperors used to visit the previous, but the current Guru was imprisoned by the emperor. In former times, the teachings of the Gurus were found in their court, but no longer, since the current Guru leads a roving life and fears nobody. The former Gurus sat in their thrones and consoled their Sikhs. The present Guru keeps dogs and hunts. The former Gurus used to compose hymns, listen to them and sing them. The present Guru neither composes hymns, nor listens or sings them. He does not keep his Sikh followers with him, but takes enemies of his faith and wicked persons as his guides and familiars. But the truth cannot be concealed. The Sikhs, like the bumblebee, are enamored by his lotus feet. The Guru supports a burden intolerable to others, but does not let it be known. So this shift happens. The Guru forms a standing army, and the Akal Takht, he sets up the Akal Takht opposite Darbar Sahib, and that's where the Sikh warriors are initiated. And we see this change, we see this shift in the Sikhs becoming this martial race. And the term that was used at the time was that what he does is that he hedges the orchard with thorny trees to protect it. And this is what's happening. Next slide, please. During the next 3 Gurus or so, the Sikhs, there's some internal conflicts, and slowly, we find that just prior to Guru Gobind Singh, the Sikhs are coming into increasing conflict with the Mughal Empire. And Guru Gobind Singh, his father, Guru Tegh Bahadur, was also executed. He was executed on the orders of Emperor Aurangzeb. Emperor Aurangzeb also killed his own brother. He imprisoned his own father. He persecuted many, not just the Sikhs. This very, very fine portrait of Guru Gobind Singh is from Patiala, from around about 1840. And there's much that we can extract from this picture. I'll show you a copy of the book later on. We've also found, miraculously, the preparatory sketch for this painting. Often Indian artists don't leave you their name. They don't often sign pictures. But the preparatory sketch for this particular painting was found in a separate location 3 years apart from this painting. And that sketch, the artist has signed it, and his name is Ram Chand. He also annotates the sketch with all the colours that he's going to use in Devanagari script. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture, and gives us an idea about how these paintings were produced. But let's look at this picture in a bit more detail. We recognize the Guru immediately. When you look at it, you don't immediately think about this being the Guru, actually. He looks like a leader. He's not just a leader, but he's also a swordsman. He's an archer. He's a royal. We have this Nahang warrior attendant beside him who holds this Kshatri, this umbrella above his head to show that he is royal. If you find a Mughal royal sword blade, it will have an umbrella stamped in the blade. That's a sign of the royal insignia. He has this Arabian imported Saluki hunting dog in the foreground. The feet of the horse are red. This red signifies that this is a battled, hardened horse. This is a horse that has gone into war. The Guru is the embodiment of the complete human for his Sikhs. He's not just a saint, he's also a soldier, he's also a worldly man. He is all-encompassing, and that's what the artist is trying to get across to us. You see his quiver with his arrows heavily embroidered with gold and silver thread, his sarpech or kalgi in his turban beset with jewels. Above him, we see this Devi, this winged goddess who has a fly whisk, a chor sahib over his head to show that he has the divine support. He has this protection from the gods for his journey, for his cause. Guru Gobind Singh wanted liberation from Mughal rule for the people. He couldn't quite appreciate how so many could not come together to expel so few when we think about the numbers of the general Indian populace and the invading Mughals. He reanimates the teachings of Guru Nanak for the modern times and gives it a new expression. And under him, we find that the rise to Sikh power begins. Next slide, please. This is a very rare and early portrait of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. Guru Gobind Singh dies in 1708. And the next 60 to 70 years or so are probably the darkest time in Sikh history. If you think about that early map, think about where the Punjab is. The Sikhs were coming into repeated conflict from both sides, either from invading Afghans and Persians from the west or from the Mughals in the east. And they were there sandwiched in this area, and they really struggled to survive in that period, the period that we call the Misl period. The way that they do survive is that the Sikhs split up into 12 confederacies or misls, and they start to govern the land. And in times of peace, they are fighting with each other. When there's an external threat from an enemy from the western front, on the western border, from Afghanistan or Persia, or the Mughals from the east, then they get together. They call Sarbat Khalsa, and they fight their external enemy. And when it's time for peace again, then they fight Sikhs fighting Sikhs again. And that's what they do. That's how they continue. Ranjit Singh, his father was Mahan Singh. He was actually born into one of the smaller confederacies, one of the smaller misls. And he comes to power. His father dies when he's about 12 years old. He becomes the leader of his misl. At the age of 17, he captures Lahore. And in 1799, he's proclaimed 1801, he's proclaimed Maharaja of Punjab. Sorry, he captured Lahore at 19, not 17. He was about so big, his face was marked with smallpox, he was blind in his left eye, but he was a very, very skilled swordsman, very, very skilled warrior who led his army from the front. This particular portrait, which is about so big, actually was once in the possession of Maharaja Dalip Singh, and it's annotated with Maharaja Dalip Singh's on the back. He's referring to this portrait of his father on the back. There's the writing of Dalip Singh. Next slide, please. As I said, the missals often came into conflict with one another. And the masterstroke really was when two particular missals came into conflict, a marriage of alliance took place. And Ranjit Singh, this is a portrait of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's first wife, Rani Mehtab Kaur. It's interestingly painted by a Sikh artist, and it's inscribed at the bottom, and the artist's name was Ratan Singh. This is about this big, this portrait, and it's painted on a small piece of ivory, which is quite common at that time as a tradition, but it's very, very fine. It's also, when we compare it to photography at the time, because these kind of portraits on ivory, they overlap with the introduction of photography to the region, and we can really get an insight into how accurate these paintings were, and this is very, very accurate. Ranjit Singh marries Mehtab Kaur, and his mother-in-law, Sada Kaur, the wife of Gurbaksh Singh, is really the driving force and the genius behind his early expansion and his early development. And she has a lot of experience, and she kind of directs him and slowly helps him to kind of control Punjab and overcome the other missals. Next slide, please. We find, when I first started collecting, I was looking for, like most young Sikh boys, looking for arms and armour, swords, daggers, helmets. I then started to collect paintings. From paintings I went to photography, from photography went to jewellery. And before you know it, you realise that you need to piece together all these pieces of this puzzle. Nobody knows what this puzzle is meant to look like, and you find that various objects will surface from time to time, and they gravitate to one another, and together they help to tell the story. Objects such as these are a wonderful pair of earrings, Karamful earrings of Rani Jindan, who was Maharaja Ranjit Singh's last wives and the mother of Dalip Singh. There's a very famous portrait of her that was painted by an artist called George Richmond, and if you search for that picture online, you'll see that she's wearing these earrings in that portrait. She's arguably probably the most famous wife of Ranjit Singh. He had a number of wives. And these earrings, they're very, very heavy. They're about this big. They're very, very heavy. They weren't actually worn through the ears. They were strung and worn through the hair, and they hung in front of the ears. They weren't strung through the ears. They'd be too heavy to be worn through the earlobes. The treasury, the Sikh treasury, was full of riches. And earrings such as these, there were about 600 pieces of jewellery of Rani Jindan that were confiscated after the Anglo-Sikh Wars. Only 4 of those pieces of jewellery are known now, and only 4 of them are known to exist now that we've discovered. There's 2 sets of earrings and 2 necklaces that we know of, out of 600 that were returned. The box for these earrings has her name written in the box in a very unusual way, and it says Maharani Judan Kaur, and it's got a very unusual, incorrect spelling. But that incorrect spelling gives us an insight and tells us actually what happened to this jewellery after her death, because it's the way that her name is spelt in the box for these earrings is the same as how her name is spelt on the probate documents after her death. So the earrings like this, amongst other artefacts of hers, went to Maharaja Dalip Singh and then probably to his children after her death, and were actually probably sold by either Dalip Singh or his children as they were trying to recover funds when they were in difficulty. I want to read you a quote here about, we know that Ranjit Singh's treasury was full of riches, but Maharaja Ranjit Singh himself was also a collector. He was collecting objects and artifacts from times prior to him. And his court is wonderfully pictured when reading this quote by Henry Fane, the British commander-in-chief who visited Ranjit Singh. And he says, I'll just read this to you. He says, "The dresses and jewels of the Raja's court were the most superb that can be conceived. The whole scene can only be compared to a gala night at the opera. The Prime Minister's son, in particular," this is Hira Singh, "the reigning favourite of the day, was literally one mass of jewels. His neck, arms and legs were covered with necklaces, armlets and bangles formed of pearls, diamonds and rubies, one above the other, so thick that it was difficult to discover anything in between them." We shall see a picture of Hira Singh a little bit later on. Next slide, please. So I'm going to race through some of the other slides. A black steatite statue of Ranjit Singh, very, very accurate depiction of him. When we look at notes on Ranjit Singh, describing his posture, his character, his musculature. I'm going to whiz through some of these. I'll just go over one quick quote from William Osborne, who said of Maharaja Ranjit Singh in 1838, he says, "By sheer force of mind, persona, energy and courage, he has established his throne on a firmer foundation than that of any other Eastern monarch. And but for the watchful jealousy of the British government, he would have long added Sindh, if not Afghanistan, to his present kingdom." So the British are watching him, they're threatened by him, but he equally is aware of them. Next slide, please. The Court of Ranjit Singh. This is a painting by Bishan Singh, an artist, a Sikh artist who was from a family group of artists from Ranjit Singh's court. And he was 28 when he painted this picture. And it's one of the finest portraits of Ranjit Singh in Darbar, in the Lahore fort. And it shows him with a number of his ministers. It's a posthumous painting. It was painted after his death. But Bishan Singh, the artist, actually entered this painting into a competition in the 1860s and won first prize for this portrait. Next slide, please. I'm just going to have a look. I want to make sure I don't miss showing you some of the important slides. If we run out of time, 1 second. Okay, let's talk about this chap. Ranjit Singh's success was mainly due to the fact that he was willing to advance, he was willing to modernize. And one way in which he did that was by incorporating and employing many Europeans at the court. And this is one particular American man of Irish, Scottish ancestry, Alexander Gardner, who was born in America, traveled through Europe, worked for the Tsar, went through Central Asia, and finally finds himself in Ranjit Singh's court in the 1830s. And Ranjit Singh employs him as colonel of the artillery. He is one of many foreigners who are working for Ranjit Singh, who helped him to modernize the Khalsa army, and they were amongst his most loyal soldiers. Next slide, please. So can we skip this slide, please, Simran, and we'll get to the next one. And this one also. Just conscious of the time. I'm going to talk to you about 2 more slides before we wrap up this. This is a portrait we've seen before, paintings of Indians, of Sikhs by Indian artists. So Indian artists are being employed by Indian patrons to paint Indian subjects. This now here, after Ranjit Singh, we have Europeans who are coming to seek patronage at the royal courts. One particular European, August Scherft, he visits Maharaja Sher Singh. This is Ranjit Singh's son from Rani Mahtab Kaur, his first wife, and he's given permission to paint the Sikhs. And this is a very famous portrait that he did of Maharaja Sher Singh. And Sher Singh is sitting on the golden throne of Ranjit Singh, which is now at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. On his right arm, we see the Kohinoor diamond that he's wearing. On his left arm, he's wearing another diamond, not much smaller than the Kohinoor, called the Darya Noor. Around his neck, he has a spinel known as the Timur ruby that was engraved with the names of Mughal emperors who had owned it before. This portrait is very important because it shows that after Ranjit Singh's death, there was a struggle for power. Sher Singh, who was on the throne at that time, was really asserting himself, and we can see that. Very much unlike his father, who would often wear very simple dress, Sher Singh is showing that he has the power. He's holding the khanda, the double-edged sword, which is the sword used to initiate Sikh warriors, and he's wearing it almost every jewel that he can get his hands on. The fact that the Sikhs still are in possession of those stones, those diamonds, that ruby, shows that this is the Sikhs at the height of their power. This is before the Punjab is taken. Both the Kohinoor and the Timur ruby are now in the Royal Collection in London, and the Darya Noor is in a bank vault in Bangladesh. It was sold in the auctions that took place in the 1850s in Lahore after the Punjab was taken. If we move on, Simran, just go through, and again, please. And just one moment. If we go back one, I'm going to show you two more pictures that help to just understand this story. This is one of the earliest portraits of Maharaja Dalip Singh, and it was in the collection of Lord Dalhousie, the Governor General of India. And it only came to light very recently. And it shows Maharaja Dalip Singh, is one of the earliest portraits painted by a European, but also one of the last portraits of him while he's still Maharaja in Punjab. And it's painted by an artist called Helen Mackenzie, and the picture later on went to Dalhousie, and it shows Dalip Singh. She also writes about when she paints this picture, and she talks about how Dalip Singh was very excited, how he himself was a budding artist. She talks about his attendants, about his jewelry, about his dress. And it's just wonderful to know that this has just surfaced very, very recently, along with the last picture that I'm going to show you. If we move on, Simran, please, and the next one. Okay. We're going to finish here on this portrait. I'm going to tell you a quick story about this. This is a portrait of Bhai Maharaj Singh. This is one of very few contemporary portraits of him, and I'm sure he's very, very familiar to all of you, and you can probably tell me much more about him than I can tell you. But Bhai Maharaj Singh, he was a real thorn in the side of the British. There was a price on his head of 10,000 rupees at the time, which is an awful lot of money. When he was captured, finally, by the British, by a man called Vansittart, he was captured alongside Karak Singh, who's with him here in this picture. It was Karak Singh's bad luck, almost, to have been with Bhai Maharaj Singh when he was captured. And they describe him at the time as not just an ordinary man. They say that he's a guru. He is to the Sikhs what Jesus Christ is to the Christians. That's how they describe him. They describe him as a man who can perform many, many miracles and who has the following of thousands. Because of that, because of the power that he held, and he was trying to bring together the Sikhs to organize a rebellion to expel the British from Punjab. That's what he was trying to do. The British couldn't trial him or execute him in India. It would have caused chaos and rebellion. So they sent him first to Calcutta, where they imprisoned him, before exiling him to Singapore, as you know. The painting was done by a man called Colesworthy Grant, who was a local artist based in Calcutta, and he writes about when he painted by Maharaj Singh, and he says that I visited him over a number of days. He said, I visited him over a number of days, and he said he hardly spoke. He said every day, he said I would come in and he would be sitting in the same position, cross-legged on the floor, facing the wall, and he said all you would hear was this deep murmur of his meditation. He also says of Karak Singh, he said he's a bit more communicative, he talks a bit more, he has a bit more humor about him, but it's his bad luck that he's with Bhai Maharaj Singh. He also says, but Karak Singh, he said, if you put a dagger in his hand, he said he'll be deadly. And that's how he describes him. So he paints his portrait of Bhai Maharaj Singh. Bhai Maharaj Singh and both Karak Singh are then exiled to Singapore, to Outram, and he put into solitary confinement. Within a few years, Bhai Maharaj Singh develops cancer of the throat. He goes blind because he's kept in the dark. There is a request to let him have some daylight hours, and that request is denied. A surgeon visits him and requests that. Karak Singh, as we're told through the archives, he says that he's willing to convert to Christianity. He says that your God is the same as our God, there's only one. But this request is denied by Lord Dalhousie, who says that if he thinks this will secure his freedom, he says then we're not going to allow him to convert. Bhai Maharaj Singh dies in jail, and he's actually cremated outside the jail by Karak Singh, and Karak Singh passes away a few years later. I found this painting about 4 years ago. Up until 4 years ago, this was still hanging up in Lord Dalhousie's house, his estate in Scotland. This came up for auction, and we're bidding really strongly on this. There were also some other artifacts at that sale. One of the other artifacts at that sale, which I really tried my hardest to buy but couldn't do so, was there was a set of chakras, a set of quoits. You know the chakras that the Nihangs used to wear, and they're the star of the flying quoits, a set of 3 gilded quoits in a frame that came from Dalhousie's house. And I was the underbidder on those. I couldn't afford to buy those, and I'd stretched on this. Anyway, they're sold. They were sold. A few months later, we happened to come across the man who bought them, and he was a Sikh. He was unknown to us prior to that. And we said to him, we said, how were those quoits when you finally got them and you received them and you got them from Sotheby's? How were they? And he said, very interesting story. He said, when I got them home, he said, I had a look at the quoits and I could see that there was space for a fourth one. There were only 3 in the frame. He said, so I contacted Sotheby's and I said to them, there was clearly a fourth one here. Where's that fourth one? Sotheby's got back to the family at Dalhousie's estate, Colston, and sent the message to them and said, is there a fourth one? Sometimes, it drops out or it drops behind a cupboard or something, or it's lost. The message comes back from the family and they say that there was a fourth one, but they said that we gave that back to the Sikhs in 1966. They said because that was the quoit of Guru Gobind Singh. And that's what they say. And when I heard that story, a little shiver went, down my spine. And they did. There were a number of artifacts that went back to the Sikhs in 1966 on the 300th anniversary of Guru Gobind Singh's birth. So that quoit was now in Anandpur. But it just made me realize, that Sikh heritage is very easy and convenient for us to think about Sikh heritage being lost. We often talk about it very negatively as a lost heritage, or it's vanished, or it's disappeared. It's not lost, it's hidden. And there's a very, very big difference. It's hidden and is yet to be discovered. So actually, we're living in a very, very exciting time because we're in the process of rediscovering it. Thank you very much. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Sorry about that. Oh, can you say about this book? Okay, thanks.
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ। ਨਾਮ ਰਸ 2018 ਦੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਸੇਵਾਦਾਰਾਂ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਵੀਰ ਦਵਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਤੂਰ ਜੀ ਦਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ। ਇਸ ਵੇਲੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਸੰਤੋਖ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ ਨੂੰ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਦਵਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਤੂਰ ਜੀ ਨੂੰ ਗੁਰੂ ਘਰ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਸਿਰੋਪਾ ਦੇ ਕੇ ਨਿਵਾਜਨ ਜੀ। ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ। ਸਾਧ ਸੰਗਤ ਜੀ, please also note Davinder Singh Toor ji will be giving an additional talk at Salat Road tomorrow at 1 p.m. And as Davinder Singh Toor Singh ji mentioned about Bhai Maharaj Singh ji, we are delighted to share that there is actually a documentary being made on Bhai Maharaj Singh ji's life with the support of Central Sikh Gurdwara Board. We will be showing an exclusive trailer all through Namras 2018. Please take a look.
He's a rebel, he's a revolutionary, he's a Sikh, and he fought against the greatest empire in the world. Well, it must have been an enormously frustrating journey for the British to try to capture Bhai Maharaj Singh. And Vansittart is sort of saying, well, if we can't get him, if the might of the British can't get him, then there must be a higher power in play, which is why he likens him to Jesus Christ. They even call him the rebel guru.
ਜਿੱਦਾਂ 70s ਹੋ ਕੇ ਵੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ 'ਚ ਜੋਸ਼ ਜਰਨੈਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸੀ ਦੁਸ਼ਮਣ ਵੀ ਹੈਰਾਨ ਰਹਿ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਸੀ।
So not many people know that Bhai Maharaj Singh is the first Sikh in Singapore. Despite Bhai Maharaj Singh's brief connection to Singapore, it is interesting how more than a century on, his legacy is very much alive. What I found fascinating, besides being just a political prisoner of the British, there were accounts of his ability to work miracles.
I believe that people come especially for their wishes.
Every day I will come and just ask for God, please give me a brother, please give me a brother. This is my brother, he's Harshad Singh.
ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਸਾਡੀਆਂ 5 ਪੀੜ੍ਹੀਆਂ ਹੋ ਗਈਆਂ ਨੇ ਬਾਬਾ ਜੀ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ, ਇਸੇ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਹੀ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸੰਗਤ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਐਵੇਂ ਪੰਜਵੀਂ ਪੀੜ੍ਹੀ, ਚੌਥੀ ਪੀੜ੍ਹੀ ਦਰ ਪੀੜ੍ਹੀ ਹੀ ਇਹ ਨਾਤਾ ਚੱਲਿਆ। ਇਹ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਡਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਜੀਵਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸੰਤ ਸਿਪਾਹੀ ਦਾ ਤੇ ਸੇਵਾ ਤੇ ਸਿਮਰਨ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਿੱਖਿਆ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਜੀਵਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਮਿਲਦੀ।
ਜੋ ਵੀ ਦਰਸ਼ਨ ਕਰਦਾ ਸੀ ਨਾ ਉਹ ਬੋਲਦਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਗੁਰੂ ਗੋਬਿੰਦ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ ਨਜ਼ਰ ਆ ਰਹੇ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ।
ਇਹ ਬਾਬਾ ਜੀ ਦੇ ਦਸਤਾਰ ਤੇ ਸਜਾਉਣ ਵਾਲਾ ਚੱਕਰ
ਇੱਥੇ ਹੀ ਪਤਾ ਹੀ ਹੈ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਚੋਂ, ਇੱਥੇ ਜਾਣਦੇ ਨੇ ਪੁਰਾਣੇ ਲੋਕ ਸਾਰੇ।
ਸਾਰੇ ਪਰਿਵਾਰ ਦੀ ਵੀ ਆਪਣੇ ਪਿੰਡ ਦੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਸ਼ਰਧਾ ਇੱਥੇ।
ਹਜ਼ਾਰਾਂ ਦੀ ਤਾਦਾਦ 'ਚ ਰੋਜ਼ ਸ਼ਰਧਾਲੂ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀ ਅਤੇ ਉਹ ਲੰਗਰ ਪ੍ਰਬੰਧ ਦੇ ਸਾਰਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਜੁਮਾ ਸੀ ਉਹ ਬਾਬਾ ਮਹਾਰਾਜ ਸਿੰਘ ਕੋਲ ਸੀ ਅਤੇ ਪ੍ਰਸ਼ਾਦ ਦੇਣ ਲੱਗਿਆ ਲਓ ਮਹਾਰਾਜ ਜੀ ਕਰ। ਸੋ ਸੰਗਤ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਬਾਬਾ ਮਹਾਰਾਜ ਸਿੰਘ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਨਾਮ ਆ ਫਿਰ ਮਹਾਰਾਜ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ ਕਹਿਣ ਲੱਗ ਪਈ। ਜਦੋਂ ਸਿੱਖ ਪੰਥ ਦਾ ਰਾਜ ਖਤਮ ਹੋਇਆ, ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ਾਂ ਦਾ ਰਾਜ ਇੱਥੇ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋਇਆ ਅਤੇ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ਾਂ ਦੇ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਜਦੋਂ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਚੁੱਕਣ ਦਾ ਸਮਾਂ ਆਇਆ ਅਤੇ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਬਾਬਾ ਜੀ ਨੇ ਕੋਈ ਕਸਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਛੱਡੀ।
ਉਹੀ ਲਿਖਤ ਲਖਾਈ ਮਹਾਰਾਜ ਬਾਬਾ, ਜੋ ਤੇਰੇ ਮਨ ਨੂੰ ਪਾਮਦੀ ਏ, ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਾਰਨਾ ਤੇਰਿਆਂ ਕੌਤਕਾਂ ਦੀ, ਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਸਿਆਣਪ ਦਾਸ ਨੂੰ ਆਮਦੀ ਏ, ਸਾਧੂ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਨੇ ਖੁਦ ਆਪ।
And what a great story, a story of a rebel, not a story of a hero on a white charger with golden armour, but a story of man that worked across with people to try to foment revolt against the colonial power of the English.
So it's like beyond just the Singapore story. It connects him to history in the Punjab.
It was a very exciting journey to be able to really kind of uncover the stories behind it, just to try to get a little bit of a glimpse into this otherwise little known character from Sikh history.
ਸਾਧ ਸੰਗਤ ਜੀ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਇਸ ਉਪਰਾਲੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹਿੱਸਾ ਲੈਣਾ ਹੋਏ ਉਹ ਪਲੀਜ਼ ਬਾਹਰ ਐਗਜ਼ੀਬਿਸ਼ਨ ਹਾਲ ਸੈਂਟਰਲ ਸਿੱਖ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰਾ ਬੋਰਡ ਦੇ ਸਟਾਲ 'ਤੇ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਪਤਾ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਨੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਹਿੱਸਾ ਲੈ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ। ਹੁਣ ਆਪ ਜੀ ਅੱਗੇ ਬੇਨਤੀ ਹੈ ਆਪ ਪਲੀਜ਼ ਮੇਨ ਦਰਬਾਰ ਹਾਲ ਦੇ ਸੱਜੇ ਪਾਸੇ ਸ਼ਿਫਟ ਹੋ ਜਾਓ। ਉੱਥੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸਟੇਜ ਲੱਗਿਆ ਹੈ ਉਹਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਹੁਣ ਮਹਾਰਾਜਾ ਰਣਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ ਦੇ ਜੀਵਨ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਨਾਟਕ ਤਾਲ ਗੁਰੂ ਪ੍ਰੋਡਕਸ਼ਨਸ ਜੋ ਪਟਿਆਲੇ ਤੋਂ ਆਏ ਹੋਏ ਹਨ ਉਹ ਪੇਸ਼ ਕਰਨਗੇ। ਤਾਲ ਗੁਰੂ ਪ੍ਰੋਡਕਸ਼ਨਸ ਨੇ ਇਹ ਨਾਟਕ ਮਹਾਰਾਜਾ ਰਣਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ ਦੀ ਜੀਵਨ ਉੱਤੇ ਖਾਸ ਨਾਮ ਰਸ 2018 ਵਾਸਤੇ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਗਿਆ ਹੈ। ਇਹ ਦੁਨੀਆ 'ਚ ਪਹਿਲੀ ਵਾਰੀ ਸਟੇਜ ਪਲੇ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ। ਇਹ ਪਲੇ ਦੇ 4 ਹਿੱਸੇ ਹਨ। ਅਗਲੇ 4 ਦਿਨਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਰੋਜ਼ ਇੱਕ ਹਿੱਸਾ ਆਪ ਜੀ ਨੂੰ ਦਿਖਾਇਆ ਜਾਏਗਾ। ਸਾਧ ਸੰਗਤ ਜੀ, humble request to kindly shift to the right side of the main Darbar hall. As you can see, there is a big lovely stage there on the left hand side of Guruji's Palki. On that stage, Tal Guru Productions, who have come here from Patiala, will be staging a play on the life of Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji. The play has been written especially for Naam Ras 2018. It has 4 acts, and each day we will have 1 act enacted in the hall before the arrival of Guruji. Today is the first act of the play. The act today focuses on Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji's birth and his early childhood. It will showcase how he fought the first battle at just years old, how he lost his father when he was very young, Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji's father passed away at the age of just 27. And then it ends by showing how Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji took over the rule of Lahore. Please, आप जी दे अगे बेनती है, आप सारे स्टेज दे अगे बैठ जाओ। ताल गुरु प्रोडक्शंस अगले कुछ ही मिनटां विच अपना स्टेज प्ले शुरू करेंगे जी। वाहिगुरु जी का खालसा, वाहिगुरु जी की फतेह।